Good morning, everyone. It's great to have you with us. The action of David Schoen prompted a major discussion in the news, social media, and just about everywhere. What did he do that was so intriguing? Well, David Schoen is an Orthodox Jewish attorney, and he represented President Trump in the Senate impeachment trial. During the trial, he is seen covering his head with his hand while drinking water. And it's interesting because Schoen was asked why he was not wearing a kippah, a yarmulke, at the trial. And he responded the following way: "I just wasn't sure it was appropriate, frankly. I didn't want to offend anyone. It's just an awkward thing, and people stare at it." Naturally, there were those who mocked him on social media, which is a terrible thing. It's un-American. We should always respect the religious expressions of others, whether it be Muslims, Christians, Jews, or whoever it might be. This is America. And coexistence is a very important thing, especially as it relates to religious differences. And whatever you might think of the former president, this is America, and everyone is entitled to legal representation. And as such, Mr. Schoen was doing his job. But that is not what I am here to discuss. The good news is that over the last few weeks, many people have asked some genuine questions about the practice of Jewish men covering their heads, and that is what we are going to delve into on today's edition of Breakfast with the Rabbi. But first, my Breakfast with the Rabbi tea. Good, that woke me up because lots to do today. I just want to mention from the outset that the practice of observant Jewish women covering their hair for the purpose of modesty is beyond the scope of today's discussion. We are confining this session to the male head covering, the kippah, as it's called in Hebrew, or skull cap, or what is commonly known as the yarmulke, which comes from two words, yareh malka, which means fear of God. It is a combination of Hebrew and Aramaic. Now let's begin with the biblical sources. From a biblical standpoint, only the Kohanim, those are the priests serving in the temple, they were required to cover their heads. There is no indication that the average Jewish male had to cover his head or did cover his head. And it's very interesting because we're filming this as we just concluded the holiday of Purim. And we read Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, twice. And what does it say in the book of Esther? It seems to imply that the head covering was a sign of mourning. That's right, mourning. In chapter 6, we are told that when the wicked Haman was instructed by King Ahasuerus to honor Mordecai and parade him around town proclaiming, "This shall be done unto the man whom the king wishes to honor," it says then in verse 12, Haman then returned to his house in mourning, having his head covered, and his head was covered as an expression of grief. Okay? There are other sources in the prophets which also speak about head covering as a sign of mourning and distress. Historically speaking, we definitely see a pattern of the head covering being perceived as a symbol of grief. As a matter of fact, as we begin to look into sources from the Talmudic period, the Talmud does indicate that complete covering of the head was a symbol of disgrace or extreme mourning. You can find more about that in Tractate Moed Katan. Although many things are written about the head covering throughout the Talmud. Here is the most famous Talmudic story, which comes from Tractate Shabbat 156b. The mother of the future Torah scholar, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, was told by a soothsayer that her son would be a thief. Heeding his warning, she instructed her son to always have his head covered so that he will have the fear of heaven upon him. She also told him to pray for God's mercy. The son obeyed, though he never understood why this was so important to his mother. What did one have to do with the other? One day, Rav Nachman was sitting under a palm tree studying Torah, and the top of his cloak slipped off his head. He was suddenly consumed with such an urge to steal that he immediately climbed the tree and bit off a cluster of dates. Can you imagine such a story? Now, a similar statement is found in Tractate Kiddushin that the scholar Rav Huna would never walk 4 cubits with his head uncovered, since the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is above my head, he said. In Tractate Sofrim, it says that the bareheaded were permitted to enter the synagogue, but were prevented from reciting the Shema in public because the bareheaded were not permitted to mention God's name. Now, here is the Talmudic text which I think reflected the actual practice in Talmudic times. In Tractate Nidarim 30b, it states, men sometimes cover their heads and sometimes do not. But women always cover their heads, and children are always bareheaded. I think that makes sense, and I would surmise that men at that time would cover their heads when engaged in prayer and other sacred activities, but would otherwise go regularly bareheaded. Now, let's look into some of the post-Talmudic sources. 13th century, Rabbi Isaac bar Moses of Vienna stated, I do not approve of the custom of the French rabbis who utter blessings with uncovered heads. That would seem to imply that there were French rabbis, I think there were rabbis yet, French rabbis who would say blessings with no head covering. Very interesting. 14th century, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, known as the Arba Turim, required the Jew to cover the head during prayer. 15th century, Rabbi Israel Isserlin ruled that a Jew must cover his head at all times. One is permitted to go bareheaded in the secular court, however. He stated that in such circumstances, one must not put his life in jeopardy, but must submit. In other words, if you're going into a place or into a circumstance where it would be dangerous for you to cover your head, then you should not cover your head in that case. Okay, let's go to the 16th century. The Maharshal, Rabbi Solomon Luria, stated that there is no law which prohibits one from pronouncing the name of God or to walk in the open with a bare head. However, since this has become a fixed custom among Jews, one must abide by it and avoid unnecessary criticism of the ignorant. Yeah, he's simply saying, look, it's not a law, but people perceive it to be something that a Jew does, and therefore if you don't do it, ignorant people are going to think that you are committing a sin. More on that a little later. 17th century, and here, pay attention to this. This is a very strict view on the issue. Rabbi David ben Samuel Halevi, otherwise known as the Taz, stated that since it is customary at present among non-Jews to remove their hats immediately after sitting down, therefore the removal of the hat is included in the biblical principle, and in their custom shall ye not walk. All right, there's a biblical principle about not imitating the ways of Gentiles. In other words, although a head covering was originally an act of piety, It gained the status of a biblical law due to the custom of non-Jews removing their caps as a sign of honor. Since the Torah prohibits Jews from going in the ways of non-Jews, one who does not cover his head would therefore be in transgression of a negative commandment of the Torah. This is very significant because the Taz is one of the very few authorities who say going bareheaded, and certainly praying bareheaded, is biblically prohibited. Personally, I find this a bit troubling because following a practice of another religion is only forbidden if you do it with the intent to imitate that religion, to imitate Gentiles. By the way, for example, if you wear short sleeves in the summer because it's hot, and Gentiles wear short sleeves in the summer because it's hot, it's a rationale for it. It's not imitating the ways of the Gentiles. You want to know what's imitating ways of the Gentiles? Human sacrifice was historically the classic case of imitating Gentiles. Worshipping idols, things like that are imitation of Gentiles, but not these kinds of domestic things that he's talking about. The 18th century, the Vilna Gaon, the Graz he was called, the great scholar in Lithuania, after an extensive discussion about the issue concludes, there is no prohibition whatsoever against going with an uncovered head. Covering your head for prayer is merely an admirable practice. The one exception is those who spend their days in the presence of God. They should wear a head covering all the time. He's probably talking about people who are always studying Torah, who are always engaged in religious activities and always engaged in doing sacred work. Those people what they would call on a higher madrega, on a higher level, religiously and spiritually, those are the people who should cover their heads full time. Okay, let's get into the 20th century now. Rabbi Moses Feinstein, Rav Moshe Feinstein, as he was known, he was the chief Orthodox halachic expert of the 20th century. He lived on the Lower East Side. Was a great gadol, as they say, a great scholar, great rabbi, and wrote volumes of very important responsa. Now, in his responsa, he ruled that based on the Taz, remember the Taz was the stringent halachic authority from the 17th century, based on that ruling, one should be stringent. He adds, however, that the Taz might agree that in America and elsewhere, where it is no longer the way of Gentiles to remove their head coverings as a sign of honor, for the most part, they don't even wear head coverings at all, the prohibition against going with an uncovered head is no longer considered to be a biblical prohibition. However, I believe that Rabbi Feinstein still considered going bareheaded to be a violation or at most a breach of a rabbinic decree. Here is a question which was asked to Rabbi Feinstein in 1973. If a person who generally wears a kippah decides to patronize an immodest dance hall, should that person remove his head covering before as to not create the misconception that such behavior is permissible? Rabbi Feinstein's reply, although the gentleman is committing one sin, we do not advise him to commit another sin by removing his head covering. I see what he's saying. In other words, two wrongs don't make a right. A couple of things here. Number one, he obviously feels that it is a sin to go with an uncovered head, which is why I believe he feels that wearing a kippah is a rabbinic decree. However, Rabbi Feinstein does rule that if a person cannot find work unless he removes his kippah, then when he's at work, he's permitted to remove his kippah. All right, so that's why I think he confines his prohibition to a rabbinic one, because on a rabbinic decree, you can be more lenient than if something is of biblical origin. The other thing I wanted to mention about his advice to the gentleman who wants to go to the immodest dancing hall is he probably feels that wearing the kippah might prevent a person from sinning. You know, if you're going in a kippah, you're a Jewish male going in a kippah, you might think twice before engaging in behavior that is immoral or unethical, at least publicly. Of course, unfortunately, there are lots of people who wear a kippah who don't do such great things, but still, it may very well have an impact, and I've known of cases where it did have an impact on people. What can we glean from this whole discussion? Clearly, there is no statement in the Bible or Talmud which gives the practice of male head covering the force of law. However, in post-Talmudic literature, we do see a fascinating evolution of the practice becoming a very strong tradition. Interestingly, you may notice that Sephardic Jews are not as strict when it comes to wearing a kippah. Many of them will not cover their heads unless they are engaged in religious endeavors, prayer and so on. I once had a conversation with a Sephardic Chacham, an important Sephardic scholar, on this very topic. And here was his analysis. He believes that many of the strictures on head covering over the last century or two is basically a reaction to the Reform movement. Historically speaking, a noticeable feature of the Reform movement's worship services was bareheadedness. I'm old enough to remember the days when if a person walked into a Reform temple wearing a kippah, he was given the choice either to remove the kippah or leave the temple. Today, however, that's no longer the case. There are some Reformed clergy and lay people who do cover their heads during prayer. I think that the trend has less to do with religion and more to do with sociology, but that's really for another discussion. But the strictures and stringencies among Ashkenazic Jews in regard to head covering is probably a reaction to the Reform movement. The Sephardic community, on the other hand, never had liberal movements. There was no Reform, conservative, or humanistic, reconstructionist, whatever it might be. No such thing existed in the Sephardic community. Every Sephardic Jew, regardless of his or her level of religious commitment, attended the same traditional shul and therefore did not feel threatened by the trends in the liberal movements. It was not something they needed to worry about. So if you see something from a great rabbi which doesn't quite seem to add up, it's probably due to the particular time and culture that it was written in. While the Reform and other liberal Jewish movements are not as influential religiously today, they were very prominent in the middle of the 20th century here in the United States. Rabbi Feinstein most likely called bareheadedness a sin because to the Reform movement, going with no kippah was a mitzvah. That was their perspective. The Reform believed that integration into modern society was the highest of values above all else, so they sought to eliminate any kind of garment or apparel which did not lend itself to replicating the Gentile world. Clearly, Orthodox leaders like Rabbi Feinstein urge you to adopt certain practices like covering your head regularly to guard against assimilation, which he saw as a very great threat to Jewry. This should explain the reason for the inconsistency in the sources over the centuries regarding the head covering. What we do know today about head covering is that even though it is not a law, it still is very much looked upon as the measure of piety among observant Jews. Is wearing a kippah a good thing? I believe that it is. Is it really consequential? In my opinion, it certainly is. Its intended purpose is to remind us that we need to recognize that God is above us, whether we are in the synagogue, at home, in the marketplace, or even at the ballpark. God actually cares about how we behave as Jews and as human beings. However, and this is very important, if you find that you are in a situation where a kippah would be injurious to your reputation, then you are under no obligation to cover your head. For example, some workplaces, schools, colleges, or other environments may not be very religiously friendly. There are also circumstances, like in the case of Mr. Schoen, where calling attention to your religiosity might be inappropriate. Now, obviously, it is different if your boss or coworker invited you to join them for a non-kosher meal. In that case, you have no choice. You have to decline and stand your ground. Eating non-kosher food is a sin, and you cannot compromise. So things of that nature, you still must be strict. But when it comes to a kippah, it is merely a custom, and even Rabbi Feinstein, who takes the stringent point of view, acknowledges that if one's livelihood is at stake, he can remove his head covering under certain circumstances. One must always remember, however, to wear a head covering during a prayer service. That's praying in the synagogue, praying in the home, doesn't matter. Always have to wear a head covering. During a meal, since we make blessings both before and after, so you need a head covering for that too. It should always be worn while studying Torah and while one is engaged in any kind of sacred activity. By the way, does the size of a kippah matter? Does size matter? No. As long as one can see the kippah on your head, as long as it is visible. What we call the very teeny kippot, they called it the bottle cap kippot, or the ones which blend into your hair. You know, sometimes you'll see someone with a uniquely gray colored hair and the kippah matches the exact color and it's very small and blends into your hair so that no one will see it. That's already inappropriate, except maybe on Purim. Maybe on Purim, you know, those kinds of apparel are appropriate. But if you are going to take on a custom, you must do it with integrity.
Call it skull cap. Some people call it beanie. Some people call it yarmulke. Kippah in Hebrew, sweetie. Some people have them knitted. Some people have them slaved. Some people have the standard white they get when in first grade. Some people have the name on it in English or in Hebrew. Some people have designs like X's, all zeros. Some people wear the hats of the Yankees, all the Mets. Some people wear the helmets of the Giants, all the Jets.